They came from the highlands of Scotland, Africa and Arcadia too. They settled in the Gulf Coast of Texas and raised cattle on the open range. They drove them through East Texas, across the Trinity and the Sabine. They followed along the Opelousas Trail to the markets in New Orleans. They're the Butlers, the Broussards, and the Campbells, Calvin Bell and James Taylor White. They're the early Gulf Coast Cowboys, and their stories will be told tonight.
When you have no talent, you have to have friends that do or raise children that do. That's my son. He played that guitar and he wrote that song for me. And so, also, she said it in the book, there's Chris Roper and Joe Hoover. Joe Hoover and I go back to the 3rd grade. We were roommates in college. I helped him through a couple of his divorces. We go back forever. But that guy, when we grew up together, see, and in church, in Sunday school, he could take 2 pieces of colored chalk and get up to the blackboard and talk about Moses was led out of there and the Egyptians were following him and here was a river, and he keep drawing and keep talking. By the time he got through, there was this mural, just a beautiful picture of the children of Israel running across the Red Sea and getting out. He's always been terribly talented. And we've always wanted to do something creative other than do things creative. So he got interested in this thing when I started talking to him about it. Chris Roper, I accidentally ran into her at a meeting, and I thought she was somebody's wife, and I was talking to her, and I thought she was a lawyer, and it led to us being put on a committee and working together. And one of the things that really attracted me to that woman was she said, I'm an editor. And I said, what? And she said, editor, you take somebody's stuff that they put together and make it into a book. Said, I helped edit the book that became The Godfather. And I said, I've got a bunch of notes about this story that I want to tell because the cattle business started down here and went east and it didn't go north. And so she's first author on the book so that I didn't have to pay her. Good deal. That's the kind of cheapskate that I am. So anyway, so in the beginning, there was John Wayne. If I can get to the next shot. But did Hollywood leave some things out? I think they did. But this was one of the scenes cut from the movie Red River. He said, you think we can get away with it? And so they were talking about that being, that movie, and they were going to make the first cattle ride. Well, it wasn't across the Red River. When Bernardo Galvez was helping the colonies fight the English, they had the 13 colonies fighting up there, and he was fighting the English across the top of the Gulf, and he sent one of his guys over to San Antonio, and they herded up a bunch of cows, and they took them, 5,000 head, over to where he was fighting the British, and that was his rolling pantry. They had the cows going along with him, and he fed his army there. So it wasn't the Red River. But it's so disheartening when you find out that John Wayne let you down. That's heartbreaking. So anyway, by the way, this is what I think really happened. We started here. Hollywood seemed to have neglected the Opelousas Trail, and the Chisholm Trail came much later. most of these slides have got a whole lot of stuff on them. You're only supposed to put about 13, 14, 15 words on the slide. So I'm going to put up the slide because there's more information there that I want to tell you, and you can read it while you're listening to me babble. But it gives you the background of all of this stuff. So, when the Spanish viceroy lifted the embargo, this guy came over here, got the cattle, took them back, and then this is a thing that came out of one of the things that I wanted to do was find out who was really involved in doing this. The three people that started the cattle business, three ethnic groups that started this were the Acadians that the English kicked out of Nova Scotia, and they came down to Louisiana, the Broussards, Joseph Broussard and his brother Andrew. And they went to St. Martinville and set up raising cattle there. The other group were the Scots, my kinfolk, that the English kicked out of the Highlands of Scotland. And then the Africans that they brought as slaves. J. Frank Dobie, who wrote about the cattle business, the Longhorns and whatever, he was at the Texas University as opposed to Texas A&M where I come from. And he said that the people that came in here didn't know anything about cattle, and the Mexicans taught them how to handle cattle. Well, I've got a document that I picked up in my research where three Highland drovers in 1719, numbers are not my thing, I'd never make it an end. 1719, they had two permits from the English government to bring 500 head of cattle out of the Highlands of Scotland down into England. So that was a pretty good while ago. So they must have known a little something about cattle. The Acadians, when they were kicked out of Nova Scotia, the English confiscated, estimated 100,000 head of cattle because they were raising cattle and they were supplying the sailing vessels that came in there to that however you pronounce that bay where they were. And so they must have known a little something about cattle. And the African nomadic tribes with their cattle herds, they've been herding cattle around since the earth cooled off, you know? So these guys did know something about cattle when they came in here. They just came to a place that was really ripe for raising them. This is another, some of the early people were from just in this area, like Dutch Hildebrandt, out of Hildebrandt Bayou. He had a huge amount of land. James Taylor White, as we talked about in that song, the people from Cade, C.T. Cade, had a huge cattle place. He did a cattle drive in 79. He was one of the largest cattle owners in this part of the world. On Bolivar Peninsula, when I was a kid, there used to be a thing called the 18-mile fence. And Perry McFaddin had half of it, and C.T. Cade had the other half. And there's an old ranch site still down there that had a plaque on it where C.T. Cade was. He was out of St. Martinsville, but most all of the people that came to do cattle came from St. Martinsville. They migrated from God knows where. James Taylor White came out of there. Hildebrandt came out of there. Most all of them in fact. And C.T. Cade. C.T. Cade was connected to the Broussards, and one of the Broussards that I met in my research, 8th generation from Beausoleil, or Joseph Broussard, who came out of Nova Scotia. This is a picture of his plantation, and that is one of the women in there is Alan Broussard's grandmother. I don't know if y'all appreciate that, but I do, and so I put it in there, and if it's boring to you, she checked to make sure that none of you brought any stones or apples or tomatoes with you, so. But anyway, James Taylor White, he came in 1817, the first time he came out of St. Martinsville to Chambers County down in Turtle Bayou, and went back and got some more cows, and got married and brought some more cows, and he's been there for all these generations. Bill White just died about recently, and he was the last white, but they have been there running that ranch. It's still in operation, and they were here before the early settlers, the old 100 came in here. So these cattle people started this country for us. And that's the White Ranch. When you drive over that waterway bridge out of High Island, you can see it off there. My wife tells a funny story. She didn't think it was so funny at the time. She had a little skipper-gay dog, and it was they bred these dogs to protect the cheese boats in Holland. And that dog was about this tall and about that long, and you picked him up, and he was just like picking up a statue. I mean, he was just all muscle. And nobody messed with my wife. You start walking toward her in an unfriendly way, that dog was right there in front of you. She was out walking on the beach, and this idiot had let his dogs loose, 2 German Shepherds and a chow, and they came running to her where the dog was. The dog, he thought that she was being attacked. He whipped 2 German Shepherds and a chow. He got chewed up in the process, but he drove them off. Anyway, they were coming back from my mother-in-law was still living here, so they were coming back. They'd been over visiting her, and they were going to take the ferry back. And they got out there by the White Ranch before they crossed, and the dog, he was hard to keep quiet. Before they crossed the waterway bridge, they came along, they were changing pastures with those cattle. And so there was about, she probably overestimated, but she said it was like 300 or 400 head of cows, a couple of guys on horses. And she had a small car, a little small Ford SUV, and said the cows were coming, and she just had to stop because they were all over the place. And she said, I sat there the whole time, and said this Bummer bull passed by, and his head was taller than the top of the window, and said the dog's name was Perot. I had Perot's mouth down, and he wanted to bark and he wanted to scream, but anyway, you should have been there. Okay, this is this Christian Dutch Hildebrandt, which Hildebrandt Bayou is named for, was one of the largest cattle owners and landowners in this part of the country in the early days. You can read all of this stuff about what he had. He ended up 9,000 head of cattle when he died, and 100 head of horses and whatever. And so these are the folks that made this country here before we found the oil, before the oil was found here. So of the people who are here, I can't imagine what it was like being here before they had the fogging machines,
Oh, yeah.
I can't imagine what it was like before they had the air conditioning. Before they had electricity, you couldn't even run a fan. Don't you know it was rough going? And then herd up 500 head of cows that hadn't seen a human and drive them to New Orleans. Yeah, that's something I'd want to do. These are some of the Broussards that crossed the river and came over here and settled in here. This is the great-grandparents of the Broussard Funeral Home folk. They have the house out near Fannette, the historical house. And my friend Hoover, the artist, he got really caught up in this. So he drew this picture of the Broussards coming to Beaumont, or to Fannette. And I spoke to Mr. Broussard, that manages the present one who manages the funeral home, and he said they came in a 2-wheel ox cart. And one of the things that I he drew the picture and he showed it to me. He said, "What do you think?" And I said, "That's great." And he said, "I want to put one more thing in there. You see that dog? Any of you recognize what kind of dog that is?" Catahoula cattle dog. The official dog of the state of Louisiana. He said, "Surely they brought one of those Catahoula dogs along with them." I said earlier that we come from up in East Texas, and back till 1948 had open range, and we all ran cattle and hogs in the woods. And I had a cousin, my wife's cousin, so he's my second or third cousin, Ben Tanner. He had a lot of cows in the woods, and he had two of those Catahoula dogs. And Ben could go in the woods with those dogs just right by himself, and he could bring out, these hooking, fighting cows. And one time was looking at them and the dogs were there, and I said, "Man, those are nice dogs, Ben." He said, he had a funny way of talking. He said, "Tommy, them dogs are a lot smarter than most of our kinfolk." So, that's what we thought about Catahoula dogs up in East Texas. Anyway, this is what the story is built, the song built around that Douglas did for me. Up in the corner of Milby Butler, who is the one that the Longhorn cattle were just about going out of existence, and he started a recovery of them, and the Butler strain of Longhorns is one of the prominent ones now. The middle piece is Alan Broussard and his grandfather crossing they take the cows and they'd swim them out to islands in the summer and let them feed there. And so he wrote a poem, and it's in the book, about something he wrote for his great-grandfather, and it's there. And James Campbell on the right, he was one of Jean Lafitte's boat captains. And when Lafitte left Galveston, he stayed behind, he and his wife, and they settled over on near Texas City. There's Campbell Bayou there. And my mother was a farm woman. There was not much that she'd back down from doing. If it needed to be done, you could count on her. So Campbell was on Galveston, and his wife was still over around Calcasieu Parish somewhere. And so he sent word to her that he wanted to settle there. He wasn't going with Lafitte. And so she brought 100 head of hogs and 20 head of cows with one slave girl about 18 years old. And they brought all of that drove of animals to Bolivar, across Bolivar, just across the Bolivar roads there from Galveston, and built a fire to signal to them that she was there. And so they came across and got the hogs. But I don't know how many of you men would be willing to call your wife in Calcasieu Parish and say, "Bring the hogs. I got a place for us here on Galveston." So just come on over. But anyhow, then down in the left-hand corner is Calvin Bell. Just outside in South Texas City, there's a place called a settlement. During slave times, these black folks were cowboys on the Butler Ranch. And after emancipation, they stayed on as cowboys and worked for wages. They went down, Calvin Bell and two other families, Hopgoods and another, went down and he bought 180 acres down in this place in Texas City. And they would build houses there and formed a community there. And the stories in there about, they drove cattle on the Chisholm Trail, and they're still out there. That community still has annual meetings, and a story about what they've done and where they've been. And Calvin Bell was one of the ringleader, if you were, the person that brought this all about. But since slave times, they have had that property, and it's still there. There's schools and whatever. And one of the stories in that book is about Harold Cash, who grew up there. Harold got with his grandfather, and they tricked him into riding a horse, and he rode it. And so he started rodeoing, and he ended up winning the national bareback bronc riding 2 times in his life. One, he rode a horse in JFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. that had never been ridden, and he got the championship from that. All right, and the other guy down there on the right is supposedly James Taylor White, who came here way back when. And this is a thing of the Opelousas Trail going over to Louisiana. But there is one other thing, and I mentioned to you about these Texas farm women. Cowboy was not always just riding down the trail strumming the old guitar like Gene did. Those of you who have had dealings with horses and cattle may be familiar with some of this. We had a little blue roan colt that best saddle horse you ever saw. She'd work cows like crazy. But every once in a while, just out of nowhere, she'd go into it and dump you. I've been thrown. Thank God I was more flexible than I am now. But that one on the left brings back memories. And then too, if you've ever had any dealings with cows, you're pushing them along, and they're just so docile, and everything's going fine, and you're humming a song, and then all at once they turn on you, it'll gore you if you don't watch it. But, so, have any of you ever been to Paladura Canyon? Did you ever see that facility there where Charles Goodnight brought his young bride to? He said, "Come on, honey, I'm going to take you to the West where we're raised in cattle, and we're going to be rich, and we're going to go down in history as one of the wonderful people." Well, she got there, and he stepped down and he said, "Wait a minute, Charles, is that the house?" "Yes, honey, that's where we're going to live till we can get some lumber and build." But that place that's an actual picture. They lived in that dugout. One thing that I find disconcerting is a book is never finished. There's always something you wish you'd have put in there, but you just got to stop and not fiddle with it anymore. And what I find when I was talking to them about coming down here is about these houses over there in Nederland, the Acadian houses in that park. I didn't know about that. I knew about the Arsenal house out at Fannette, and I got that in my book, and I researched that and did. So I needed to go and write about them, but I'm not going to. I got to stop. There's a time you got to stop. But the thing that I liked about it was the way they built the Acadian houses, and they put the mud in between, and they used the wood that made the house, the sassafras wood, that made the house smell like root beer. I mean, what a touch. But many things were left out. Beaumont has for many years possessed historical markers commemorating everything. This is a quote from Block. "Of no less historical worth would be a marker which chronicled a century of cattle crossing over the Natchez." And Block wrote this story about Aaron Spell. He was 6'6", and so when they'd bring the cattle down, they'd have to ford, and there were no bridges. They had to ford them across the river, taking them over, and some of them would drown. And the city fathers in Beaumont said they had to put a stop to that, so they started putting a tax on however many cattle drown. And so the drovers made a deal with Spell. And what he would do, here's this guy, 6'6", with 200 and something pounds. he'd grab the lead steer by the horns and drag it into the water and start swimming across. Now, I don't know what kind of OSHA regulation would have been violated by that, but can you imagine? But anyway, something wonderful came out of it. How many times have you heard somebody say, taking a bull by the horns? Now you know what they were talking about. Many of these contributions have been left out, but getting back to another part of it, things Hollywood neglected, contributions to history that have been not accorded. Before you get too misty-eyed about that, I've got to throw in this little thing. Did you ever wonder where the Texas Cowboys came from? I mean, how there wasn't no magic wand. It started over in a no man's land between the Calcasieu and the Sabine. For many years, that was wild country. And people would lose cattle in there. So finally they formed a vigilante group. And they sent word to the rustlers, y'all better stop this or clear out. So the rustlers sent back word, we ain't leaving because this is easy pickings. So the vigilantes got, well, you see the guy in his Confederate coat there and a little 9-pounder. So the vigilantes held up in this store and they had all kind of equipment like pistols and rifles and whiskey, and vigilantes and the ex-colonel of the Confederacy pulled up there and gave them a chance to get out, and they sent back a message which I cannot repeat in mixed company, and so they said, we'll give you one more chance, and they said no. So then the rustlers started shooting. And so they rolled out this 9-pounder and they fired a round through the store. And the rustlers dropped pistols and rifles and whiskey jugs and all that and came out and said, we've had enough. So they brought in somebody who was supposedly a judge, and he gave them a choice of taking 50 lashes and stop rustling cattle or go to Texas.
Oh.
I'll let you form your own conclusion.
I believe that.
All right. There was another part of it that was left out. And as I told you about, there were these Texas women. They were capable.
Wow.
I don't think I need to say anything about it. You can figure it out that one. There they are in their long skirts and their hats and all that, branding cattle. And there was even, there were a lot of different people, different types, cattlemen, so even a black cowgirl. And right at home here, the Butlers, they had the Butler Ranch, and George Washington Butler and J.C. League were in the cattle business, the League City name for him. And they worked cattle, they worked longhorns, they worked, brought in cattle to improve the breed. But they had a lot of money. But these are the Butler girls. And you see, they weren't sitting around sipping tea.
Okay.
They were out there helping get cattle up the Chisholm Trail and working right along, maybe leading the men, if not working alongside them. But then the settlement, as I mentioned before, has been there since 1867, when they got the money and when they started working for wages and bought that property. And then some of the early Gulf Coast Cowboys, this is George Washington Butler, Melby, and two of his other, into bringing a spur line down to the League City area. And when they could load them on the cattle cars, It was much easier to get them to market. And that was the death knell for the longhorn, because you don't want a bunch of cows in there with horns like that inside a cattle car, because they kill one another or get down and would be butchered up. So one of the people, and like I say, there's a book is never finished. I found later that Perry McFaddin bought the first Brahma bull into this country, bought it from a traveling circus. And so Brahmas could take this climate. I mean, because they come from a place in India that was a lot like this. You know, most people can't take this climate, much less the cattle. And so they started breeding them down with more beef, more body, less horns. And the cattle business ended, the cattle drives ended with the arrival of the railroad. I don't know how, I had a song that I wanted her, I talked to her about possibly playing. It's called Texas, When Texas Was Free. Fella I know up in Lubbock. But it said at a time when there were no fences, no telephone towers, the sky was bluer and brighter than it is today, and you could hear the wind whistling through the grass. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could go back there with all the shots, you know, for and see that? So anyway, this is what I've done. The book is there. You're welcome to, and the book's over there that I've looked at. And if you have any questions, I will attempt to avoid them in any way that I can. And so that's all I know, and that's all I'm going to say. Yes,
One question. How did it all play with the original 300 families and the Mexican deal and all that? How did these guys on the Gulf Coast survive all that?
they didn't pay any attention to anything. Somewhere, and I say that James Taylor White took care of business and he lived under 6 flags. He didn't pay any attention to them. He stayed over there and minded his business, raising cattle. They come and they go. They wrote the only time they ever got involved was that Turtle Bayou Resolution, where they, wanted to secede from Mexico, and the people that were really involved in that met at his place. But most of them, they didn't care anything about government. They ignored everybody. They just raised cattle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of history on that, about how Mexico did all the,
Yeah.
when the original 300 families started those meetings,
Yeah.
and boy, Santa Anna found out about
Yeah.
that. He
Oh,
didn't
it
like
went
that at all.
crazy, yeah. But I love the thing over at that fort just before you cross over to Galveston, where Fanning, they stake Fanning down to
Oh, yeah.
It's wonderful, wonderful history. Yes, ma'am, there was a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Have you ever heard the story? I don't know if it's accurate or not, but after the Alamo and the San Jacinto,
Yeah.
that they took Santa Anna to the White Ranch.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard that?
Yeah. There's a documentation of that.
Okay.
Into a tree.
Yeah.
And then they took him to New York
Yeah.
from there. But, that I was saying about truth is stranger than fiction. When you start digging into this, where we are and where we live, the most ungodly things were done here. They're just unbelievable. You read that and you say, "Oh, that can't be true." But anyhow, other questions? I'm gonna go.
It's been a wonderful lecture,
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
really.
I enjoyed doing it.
Yeah, thank you.
How do we purchase a book?
What I'd like to do is, if you purchase a book, if you would make the check or give the cash to this library, anyone you buy, you pay them for it,
Okay.
okay?
Where they at? I'm gonna pick up one. That's what I come for.
Me too.
I need to get
But the money goes, all of it goes to them, huh?